Every year, far from the cameras and noise, those who did not run for office but control the future gather in the Swiss mountains. Presidents, billionaires, heads of corporations and special services. Davos is not just a forum. It is a room where the map of the world is redrawn. Why do the decisions made there become binding for everyone? Who is behind the idea of a new order? And is it possible to leave the game once you've taken a seat at the table? Today, we will open the doors to a place where not everyone is allowed to enter. And we will tell you what really happens in Davos. High in the Swiss Alps, in the tiny town of Davos, people who rule the world gather every year. The place looks like a ski resort. Snow-white slopes, quiet streets, wooden houses. But once a year, motorcades, security guards and helicopters arrive, and the town turns into a fortress. The President of France, the Chancellor of Germany, the head of the IMF, the CEOs of Amazon, Pfizer and Google, ministers, bankers, sheikhs, and army generals all meet in one building. Not to give a press conference, and not to talk about the weather. The World Economic Forum, as this event is officially called, was born in the early 1970s. At that time, German economist Klaus Schwab proposed the idea of bringing together European business people and scientists to discuss new challenges. The first meeting took place in 1971, modestly, without world leaders. But in just a decade, the forum grew into a center of attraction for politicians, bankers, academics, and strategists. Its format was unique. Behind closed doors, without direct commitments, but with direct influence. Why Davos? Partly because of its seclusion. The town is difficult to guard, cut off from the world, and that is precisely why it is easy to ensure complete confidentiality there. No one eavesdrops, no one films negotiations between the US president and the director of a Chinese corporation. Davos has become the informal capital of a new world. A world where decisions are not necessarily formalized in documents, but have global consequences. Officially, the forum's mission is to improve the state of the world. The topics vary: climate, digital transformation, sustainable development, healthcare, the future of work. Every decade, a new agenda emerges. In the early 2000s, it was the fight against poverty. In the mid-2000s, it was innovation and startups. In the 2020s, it is climate, vaccination, and digital passports. But the underlying theme remains the same: global governance without national barriers. Critics of the forum believe that Davos is not a place to seek solutions, but rather a club for those who want to keep power in their own hands. Indeed, the composition of participants remains almost unchanged. Once accepted into the Davos circle, people remain there for a long time. Moreover, they grow within it. Little-known ministers become presidents. Scientists become UN advisors. Business people become figures who determine the economic future of entire continents. Interestingly, the forum does not have the status of an international organization. It is a private initiative registered in Geneva as a foundation, and yet its influence often exceeds that of the UN, NATO, and even the G20 summit. Why? Because Davos is not a place for discussing decisions that have already been made. It is a place where these decisions are only being formed. It is a place where trends are set, not summarized. It is a place where you can meet the CEO of a major pharmaceutical giant and discuss the next global vaccine purchases over a cup of coffee. It is a place where the foreign minister of one country can be hinted that it is time to reconsider his position on digital currencies. Many call this soft power. Others call it a shadow government. But one thing is clear. The Davos Forum is no longer a place for discussion. It has become an arena for shaping new realities. And if the UN says that agreements need to be reached, then in Davos, they have already been reached. You just don't know it yet. Every year, it is not just politicians and economists who flock to Davos. The elite gather here, not in an abstract sense, but in a literal sense. At the entrance to the convention center, there are people whose names rarely appear in the news, but they are the ones who control the flow of capital, determine the strategic directions of industry, and influence technology, healthcare, defense, media, and education. There are dozens of people who could be called top-level figures, but the real power lies with those who remain in the shadows. The World Economic Forum is famous for its closed sessions, which are not open to journalists or even most participants. In these halls, meetings are held where the president of one of the world's largest countries can sit opposite the head of an investment fund with assets worth trillions of dollars. And those who manage these assets are capable of doing more for the country's economy than an international bank or the state budget. Regular guests at the forum include presidents and prime ministers from almost all developed countries: France, Germany, Japan, Canada, India, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia. The United States is represented not only by the heads of the White House, but also by figures such as the Secretary of State, the head of intelligence, and special representatives for climate and the economy. Representatives from China, including President Xi Jinping, have also visited. It is a place where even those who are formally in a state of Cold War meet. But the list of participants without government positions is even more interesting. Founders and heads of the world's largest corporations, from Microsoft and Amazon to BlackRock and Goldman Sachs. Editors-in-chief of major media outlets, rectors of leading universities, representatives of the Vatican, the UN, UNESCO, artists, directors, Nobel Prize winners, and, of course, the founders of major charitable foundations. A person controlling food supply chains in Africa and a person developing neural networks for surveillance in Asia may find themselves sitting at the same table. Each forum participant is assigned a level of access. There are different colored badges that determine which areas you can enter, who you can listen to, and who you can talk to. This informal protocol determines who is considered a figure of global importance and who is just a guest. An invisible hierarchy is established in Davos. You cannot accidentally sit down at a table with someone influential. Everything is planned in advance. There is even an internal term, Davos man. This is the name given to someone who thinks in terms of markets rather than countries. Someone who does not divide people into friends and foes, but sees the world as a field for strategy. Davos man is not elected and does not report to voters. He is not subject to the laws of any one country, but only to the logic of global governance. This is, in essence, a new class, transnational, without national borders, but with influence that exceeds the capabilities of any national elite. It is noteworthy that many heads of state, upon arriving in Davos, literally line up to get an audience with representatives of certain corporations or foundations. A politician may ask for investment, support, or a promise of stability. In return, he must be prepared to implement a specific agenda. This could be the introduction of digital currency, the development of green energy, or the abandonment of a certain political course. Everything is done in a veiled form, without coercion. But anyone who ignores these signals risks being isolated, politically, financially, and informationally. There is another level of participants, young, promising cadres. They are specially selected, trained, and introduced into the elite through forum programs. It is precisely these figures who, in a few years' time, become ministers, presidents, and heads of major institutions. They are already being called Davos protégés. They are trained to think correctly, speak the right language, and use the right words. Sustainability, transformation, inclusiveness, green growth. But behind the pretty words lies a harsh selection system. If you want to be part of the game, you have to follow the rules. No open criticism, no unexpected decisions, no steps to the side. Davos is not about experimentation. It is about control, and those who come here understand this perfectly well. That is why they go. The official agenda of the Davos Forum always sounds noble: fighting poverty, protecting the climate, innovation in medicine, digital literacy, developing green energy, a sustainable future for all. Celebrities and scientists, politicians and philanthropists take to the stage to discuss how to make the world a better place. Cameras capture every word, and it seems that this is where a bright new era for humanity is being born. But if you look closer, it becomes clear that the real decisions are not being made in the halls where the broadcasts take place. They are being made in other rooms, behind closed doors. There are no cameras, no journalists, and even participants need special permission to enter. These are private sessions, one-on-one meetings where actions are discussed, not principles, not ideals, but concrete steps. There are many examples of this. When the need to transition to digital services and remote work was actively discussed in Davos in the mid-2000s, it seemed futuristic. But within a few years, corporations began to invest heavily in the necessary infrastructure, and governments began to change legislation. The same thing happened with ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance. At first, it sounded like a voluntary initiative. Today, it is a global standard on which investments and company ratings depend. The pandemic has shown how this system works in practice. In January 2020, when the coronavirus pandemic was still only being discussed in expert circles, closed meetings were already taking place in Davos with representatives of major pharmaceutical companies, the World Health Organization, politicians, and investors. A few months later, these same participants were controlling vaccine logistics, certification standards, digital passports, and the principles of the new normal. Is this a coincidence? Perhaps, but it is suspiciously accurate. Formally, the Forum does not make decisions. It has no legal force, but its power lies in coordinating positions. What is born here becomes part of everyday reality in a year or two, sometimes without a vote, sometimes without public discussion. Davos sets the framework for thinking. It determines what the world will think about and in which direction it will move. Take, for example, the concept of a universal basic income. When it first appeared on the forum's agenda, it seemed like a utopia. But within a year, several countries had launched experimental programs, or the idea of zero emissions. It also started as rhetoric, and then became a norm, the disregard of which threatens sanctions, loss of investment, and international isolation. Less pleasant topics are also being discussed behind the scenes. For example, global population reduction as a factor in sustainable development, or control over food chains, or the introduction of digital identity with biometric parameters. All these topics are on the agenda, but only in closed sessions to which only a select few are admitted. The risks, strategies for influencing public opinion, and the creation of an Overton window, the gradual familiarization of the population with previously unacceptable ideas, are also discussed there. The role of the mainstream media should not be forgotten either. Numerous media companies are also represented in Davos, but not only as observers. Journalists from the largest television channels and publications are included in the list of participants and receive instructions on how to cover the forum. This is not about propaganda, but about coordinating the message. The talking points that are supposed to dominate the information field are discussed in advance. It is therefore not surprising that after the forum, almost identical articles with the same emphasis appear in the global media. Many countries make changes to their strategic documents after Davos. These changes may concern energy, taxation, digitalization, or migration policy. Sometimes this looks like coordination. Sometimes it looks like external pressure. But the main thing is different. Davos does not just discuss. It coordinates. It unites the interests of those who control resources, information, and technology. This means that it becomes more than just a forum. It becomes a headquarters. To understand the power of Davos, just look at how the decisions discussed there become global rules of the game. No country is formally obliged to comply with the forum's resolutions. But a few months after the discussions, new ideas begin to be implemented almost simultaneously around the world. How is this possible? The answer lies in mechanisms of influence that are not visible on the surface. Let's start with finance. One of the main tools is transnational investment funds. The largest of these, such as BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, send delegations to Davos every year. These structures control not only corporations, but entire sectors of the economy. If a fund declares that from this year onwards, it will only invest in companies that comply with the forum's climate agenda, this changes everything. Banks, pension funds, and business platforms are forced to comply or lose money. The same principle works in politics. If a consensus is reached in closed sessions in Davos that a particular country or its government is not in step with the global agenda, pressure begins: economic, informational, diplomatic. This can take the form of sanctions, the suspension of negotiations, or changes in trade conditions. Formally, no one is violating sovereignty, but in reality, weak countries lose their voice. Take the climate campaign, for example. The idea of a zero carbon footprint, which initially sounded like a nice slogan, quickly became mandatory. Davos was the central platform where heads of state, CEOs of energy giants, and activists discussed how quickly coal and gas production could be phased out, and then how to transition the economy to renewable sources. 2 years later, the European Union began introducing green taxes. Large funds began excluding dirty companies from their portfolios, and by the end of the decade, many countries had banned the sale of cars with internal combustion engines. Another example is digitalization. Davos played a key role in promoting the ideas of digital identity, biometric passports, and blockchain accounting systems. These topics were discussed in small circles even before the pandemic began, and then they became the norm. Many countries have introduced digital vaccination passports, which could eventually become universal ID cards. Next up is digital currency. Central banks have begun actively developing national digital currencies, which was also discussed in Davos long before it became news. Technology and artificial intelligence are a separate front. Forum panels discuss not only the possibilities, but also the rules. Who will control neural networks? How can we limit the freedom of AI? How can we build ethics into code? The guidelines adopted at the discussion level are quickly reflected in the work of companies and governments. Regulators are starting to use the same terms that were heard at the forum: ethical AI, transhumanism, and human-centric approach. The forum's influence is particularly noticeable in times of crisis. When a military conflict, environmental disaster, or economic downturn erupts, governments begin to act in accordance with the recommendations previously voiced in Davos. Why? Because the forum has another powerful lever: international consultants. After the forum, dozens of experts funded by global structures travel around countries with ready-made solutions. They implement recommendations, train officials, and create roadmaps for reforms. This is how the mechanism for implementing a new reality works. Davos does not give direct orders. It designs, and then it sets in motion a self-fulfilling mechanism. Through business, through ratings, through the media, through influence on the agenda in universities and international organizations. It is a network, and it is dense. Finally, Davos controls the language. This may seem unimportant, but it is actually critical. Concepts such as sustainable development, inclusive growth, green transformation, global solidarity, and equal access are all terms developed within the forum. They are repeated by ministers, journalists, teachers, and corporate leaders. Language changes perceptions, and that means it changes actions. That is why Davos is not just a platform. It is a laboratory for the future. The only thing is that no one votes to live in these scenarios. They are simply implemented, and everyone else is forced to catch up or submit. To understand who is behind the Davos Forum, you need to look at its founder, Klaus Schwab. He is a figure who inspires respect, fear, and mistrust all at once. Born in Switzerland in the mid-20th century, he trained as an engineer and then earned a doctorate in economics. In the early 1970s, he launched what was initially called the European Management Forum. Years later, it grew into the World Economic Forum. But it is not only Schwab who is important, but what he has created around him. The forum is not just an annual conference. It is an entire ecosystem that includes think tanks, consulting firms, charitable foundations, educational programs, and a network of professionals called Young Global Leaders. It is this network that raises the most questions and suspicions. The Young Global Leaders program, created in the early 2000s, officially aims to identify and support talented managers, politicians, entrepreneurs, and public figures who may influence the world in the future. It sounds like a typical talent pool. But take a look at the list of alumni, and you'll start to feel uneasy. Among them are the presidents of France and Argentina, the prime ministers of Canada and Finland, ministers from Germany, New Zealand and Belgium, the former head of Twitter, top managers from Google, Facebook and Pfizer, heads of international NGOs, and journalists from major publications. These people come to power or get key positions just a few years after participating in the program. They have already passed the filter: ideological, behavioral, communicative. They know what to say. They know how to think. And most importantly, they are embedded in a global network that provides them with support and resources. This is not a conspiracy. It is a strategy. The forum is not run by one person. It has a board of trustees, which includes representatives of the world's most influential corporations, international organizations, and former heads of state. It is a kind of Politburo of global capitalism. It is here that decisions are made about which topics to promote, which initiatives to support, which technologies to test, and which countries to encourage. Klaus Schwab has become a symbol of this system. His ideas are often controversial, especially after the publication of his book, The Great Reset, released in the midst of the pandemic. In it, he describes how the world can and must change after the crisis, from digitalization to the abandonment of property. It was from this book that the famous phrase, "You will own nothing and be happy," was born. Schwab claims that this is not an order, but a scenario. Critics say it is a manifesto. The forum has its own research departments that model the future. They publish risk reports, climate forecasts, migration data, and economic scenarios. These documents are then used by governments, corporations, NGOs, and even the UN. In this way, a unified agenda is formed, based on the same starting points. Anyone who wants to receive funding or be heard must speak this language. A special role is assigned to the forum's partners. These are more than 1,000 corporations that are members of the so-called Strategic Partners Club. Among them are major banks, IT giants, pharmaceutical companies, and telecommunications corporations. Membership in this club costs millions of dollars. But this money is not an entrance fee. It is an investment in influence. Partners receive priority access to key sessions, the opportunity to shape the agenda, and influence reports and recommendations. Media support is also worth mentioning. The forum actively works with the world's largest media outlets. Many journalists are graduates of the forum's programs or participants in closed briefings. This allows them not only to control the agenda, but also to shape public opinion. News, analysis, columns, all of this works to reinforce the messages developed in Davos. Thus, the World Economic Forum is not just an annual meeting of the elite. It is a structure with a clear architecture, hierarchy, mechanisms of influence, and a long-term strategy. It has a face, Klaus Schwab. It has a young generation, the global leaders. It has partner structures, from foundations to corporations. All this is united by the idea of managing the future, without elections, without mandates, but with complete control over those who receive these mandates. So many rumors have accumulated around Davos that its name has become almost synonymous with conspiracy. For some, it is a symbol of progress and global cooperation. For others, it is the embodiment of a new world order in which decisions are made not by governments, but by puppet masters. Conspiracy theories surrounding the forum can be ignored, but we can try to understand where they come from and why they are becoming more prevalent. The most famous theory is about the so-called shadow government. According to this theory, Davos serves as an arena where the elite coordinate global processes, from regime change to epidemic management. In this model, presidents are merely a facade behind which the real decision-makers hide. And although this sounds exaggerated, it must be acknowledged that Davos does indeed bring together people who wield power without elections, resources without limits, and influence without borders. The second theory is about the Great Reset as a project to restructure the world. After the publication of Klaus Schwab's book of the same name, conspiracy theorists saw in it a plan: the abolition of private property, the introduction of a universal basic income, digital identity, and total surveillance. Memes, slogans, and expose videos appeared. Opponents of the forums began to call participants architects of a digital concentration camp. Although the book itself presents such ideas as a discussion of possible scenarios, the manner of presentation and the timing of its release heightened the alarm. There are even more radical views. Some claim that population reduction is being discussed in Davos under the guise of sustainable development. Others are convinced that the forum coordinates global crises: economic, environmental, and migratory. There have even been theories that forum participants receive information about artificially created disasters and adjust their strategies in advance. However, we need to separate real mechanisms of influence from speculation. Yes, the forum is opaque. Yes, it lacks democratic legitimacy. But that does not mean that every word it utters is part of a sinister plan. On the other hand, secrecy and the concentration of power in private hands inevitably give rise to suspicion. People feel that someone is controlling reality, but they don't understand who or how. Davos has become a symbol of this uncertainty. The forum's organizers themselves try to respond to criticism. They publish reports, broadcast live, and allow independent experts to attend. But the main accusation against Davos is not that it is hiding something, but that it determines the framework for discussion. It sets the agenda and the context for what can be discussed. Everything else is either marginalized or ignored. This is how a global consensus is formed that cannot be challenged. There is a third way, the pragmatic one. Many analysts recognize that the Davos Forum is not a conspiracy, but a structure that simply does its job better than the rest. While countries are preoccupied with internal conflicts, the forum builds horizontal connections. While societies argue about local problems, Davos builds the architecture of global governance. There is no mysticism in this. But there is a reality in which influence is redistributed in favor of those who can think systematically and coordinate across borders. So, should we fear Davos? Or should we fear a world in which such structures are no longer constrained by any popular mandate? Davos seems like a voluntary meeting, a forum you can choose to attend or decline. But in reality, leaving Davos is much more difficult than getting there. It is not just an event. It is a system that draws you in and keeps you there. Many politicians who have attended the forum have subsequently admitted that participating in Davos is like an initiation. You don't just listen to speeches. You pass through a network of contacts, promises, and mutual expectations. You find yourself in a field where you are expected to toe the line. And if you deviate, the consequences will not be long in coming. There have been cases where state leaders who refused to participate in the forum or criticized it soon faced a sharp deterioration in the foreign policy climate. Their countries were subjected to economic pressure. The media launched campaigns against undemocratic regimes. International organizations withdrew their support. None of this is direct sanctions imposed by the forum. But the effect is as if you have stepped outside the bounds of what is permissible. This is particularly noticeable in relation to those who have tried to challenge key concepts supported by Davos: the climate agenda, digital identity, vaccination policy, and the principles of sustainable development. These figures lost their positions, found themselves isolated, and became targets for investigations and smear campaigns. Coincidence? Perhaps. But too often, this coincidence repeats itself. The forum works subtly. It does not coerce. It offers. But it offers something that is impossible to refuse. If you are in the system, you get resources, protection, access to information, and channels of influence. If you are outside it, you are left alone. Today, in an interconnected world, being outside Davos means being outside the process. This is the power of the forum. It does not demand obedience. It makes obedience convenient, profitable, and practically inevitable. Davos is not a conspiracy. It is a structure in which control is ensured not by violence, but by inclusion. This is the new order. An order in which power no longer belongs to those who elect it, but to those who know how to create a world in which there is no longer any choice.